Let us pray. O Lord, grant us a daily awareness of the precious gift of life which you have given us. As members of this Legislative Assembly, we dedicate our lives anew to the service of our province and our country. Amen.
Introduction of visitors.
Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure on behalf of the Deputy Premier to introduce His Excellency Per Fergo, who is the Ambassador of Denmark, who is seated in your gallery, Mr. Speaker. He is accompanied by the Honorary Consul of Denmark in Edmonton, Mr. Don Larson, and I would ask all members to greet these visitors with our special welcome.
Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Private Bill number 23, Federal Canadian Trust and Bond Corporation. The purpose of this bill is to incorporate a trust company.
The honourable member for Highwood has moved for first reading Bill number PR 23, Federal Canadian Trust and Bond Corporation Act. Members willing to give assent to first reading, please say aye. Opposed, please say no. So ordered.
Bill PR 23, being Federal Canadian Trust and Bond Corporation Act, introduced by Honourable Member Mr. Alger, is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports. Introduction of special guests.
Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs, it is an honour for me to introduce 4 members of the Rotary International in Great Britain and Ireland. They have come to Canada on a group study exchange visit. The team leader is Mr. Howard Briggs, and the team members are Mr. Mark Barnes, Mr. Greg Davies, and Mr. David Hallborn. They are seated in the Speaker's Gallery, and I would ask them to rise so that members may give them a traditional welcome to this Assembly. Mr. Speaker, today is my day for introductions. On behalf of the Premier, who is unable to be there to introduce a group of students from the Edmonton Whitemud constituency, I am pleased to introduce a group of 44 students from the grade 6 class of the Sweetgrass School. They are accompanied by their teachers, Miss Marie-Anne McLean, Mrs. Pat Smith, Mrs. Vera Foreman, and Mr. Dave Ramsankar. I would ask them to rise and receive the traditional welcome of this Assembly.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce 53 of the brightest grade 6 students in Camrose from the Chester Ronning School. They're accompanied by 2 teachers, Mr. Alan Tronson and Mrs. Jeanette Rotto. They're seated in the public gallery, and I'd ask the Assembly to give them the warm welcome once they stand.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Mr. Speaker, I think Albertans were a little shocked this morning to learn that the Premier has made threats about, quote, to pull out of the bloody country, close quote, if he doesn't get his way on the Meech Lake Accord. It's extremely odd that the Premier would decide to play his separatist card at this particular time in those negotiations. I wonder if the acting Premier would assure this Assembly and all Albertans that this government will quickly drop this idle and irresponsible threat.
Mr. Speaker, it's inappropriate, I think, to respond to news stories. It's something that is rarely done in the House, and I think that the honourable member might put her question to the Premier when he returns to the House tomorrow.
We won't get a passport.
Honourable member, there's also a problem under parliamentary use of the word irresponsible. Secondary supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Acting Premier, thanks for the lesson in protocol, but that doesn't answer the concerns of Albertans who did wake up to this issue on every radio station in the country. Albertans would like to know what type of consideration goes into this type of policy pronouncement from the Premier. Will the Acting Premier explain what type of consideration has led to this statement?
Mr. Speaker, the acting leader of the New Democratic Party, I'm sure, can restrain her interest in this subject until the Premier returns.
Mr. Speaker, the last time I looked, question period was for consideration of urgent matters. If this isn't an urgent matter, talking about pulling one province out of the country isn't an urgent matter, I don't know what is, Mr. Speaker. You'll get the question. Beg your pardon? Well, that would be very interesting. That's right. Well, I do like to respond when the Honourable Treasurer feels that it's important to ask me a question. Mr. Speaker, will the Acting Premier confirm then that this sort of statement is not a government policy? It has never been discussed as Plan B or Scenario C. It is not a government policy. Confirm that.
Mr. Speaker, I've already responded twice to two earlier similar questions, and I would suspect that the members are all prepared to wait until the Premier returns tomorrow to hear directly from him.
Won't let him cross the border.
Final supplementary question, Mr. Speaker, perhaps this time to the Deputy Premier. I think in the wake of these unfortunate comments, whether or not they represent a government policy, that it's an important issue, what steps will the Acting Premier now take to redress the concerns that have been become important in the minds of Albertans and Canadians? What steps will he take?
Mr. Speaker, just what unfortunate statements is the honourable member referring to? Nothing she read in the paper, I hope.
Order, please. Order, please. The Chair requests the member for Edmonton Highlands to withdraw the earlier comment, which was irresponsible.
I'll do so now.
Westlock Sturgeon, supplementary.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Deputy Premier. I'm sure he was appointed Deputy Premier because he was simpatico or at least familiar with the Premier's thinking. Would he care to categorically deny any possibility that the Premier would even think of pulling Alberta out of Confederation?
Mr. Speaker, there's been no stronger builder of Canada in any of the provinces than the present Premier of Alberta, and that goes for his predecessor as well. And I'd suggest if the honourable members of the opposition are going to participate in the question period, that they should perhaps take the time to obtain the script or the transcript of the interview with the Premier, rather than rely on what may be called unreliable reporting. I can categorically deny that the Premier is thinking of taking Alberta out of Confederation.
Second main question, Edmonton Highlands.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to designate the second question to the member for Edmonton Calder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Social Services, the Minister has apparently stated that although we've got lots of rules in place for daycare, people are constantly breaking them. She has also stated that parent diligence is the only guarantee of adequate daycare standards for our children. Will the Minister confirm that she believes her department to be incapable of enforcing daycare standards? And if she believes this is not to be the case, can she advise what other possible meaning ought to be placed on her remarks?
Mr. Speaker, we do have adequate standards in place, and I am encouraging parents to also be vigilant in addressing the respective daycare centres in terms of those standards being in place.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if the police use that system, we'd really be in trouble. Supplementary to the Minister, what role does the Minister see for the daycare licensing branch if, in fact, a license is meaningless in terms of ensuring safe and healthy care?
Mr. Speaker, the member prefaced her first question by speaking to some degree to words that I have said about laws that are being broken. I think this legislature sits for many hours on end evolving statutes, as does the federal House, and yet there we are with not only police forces in place, but also various departments with enforcement officers in place to try and see that the rules are kept. If the rules were always going to be kept, we wouldn't need the enforcement bodies. But we do not have the resources to have one person watching every other person in our society. And we believe that we have a balance in terms of enforcement procedures. Daycare licensing officers aren't in place every single day in every single centre. Parents are. And what I have said is that parents have a very good opportunity where they believe that infractions are have been in place in a centre, that they report those infractions. And certainly the very best use of our resources is then to follow up on those reports, as well as reports from other people.
Supplementary to the Minister. It seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that when you set standards, you accept responsibility. As the Minister is now shifting responsibility for quality care from her department onto parents, is she prepared to supplement wages for parents so they can take time off work to receive training in fire and health regulations, departmental standards, and so that they can spend some time so that they can properly monitor their daycares?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, we have licensing officers that do visit the daycare centres. We also have a social care facilities review committee that visits daycare centres. We have health units who have officers visiting daycare centres. We have fire inspectors visiting daycare centres. And all of those people report infractions, not only in terms of their own authorities, but to us. And I would say, Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member believes that parents should put blinders on when they take their children every day to a child care centre, then I believe that she's very sadly mistaken.
Final supplementary to the Minister. Mr. Speaker, parents want assurance that their children are receiving proper care. Given that the Minister has indicated that the Department's enforcement capability is extremely limited or non-existent, what possible assurance can the Minister give to parents that their children are receiving proper care, that the same paper towel is not being used to wipe the baby's bottom and then their hands and their faces?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I believe that what I've indicated is that with regard to all government functions, police functions, licensing functions, and so on through our society, there is not unlimited resources. But I have certainly not indicated that we are unable to enforce. But I would categorically say that this is a concern that all people have. And I think the honourable member somehow is putting in context her belief that parents are not interested in looking at the conditions in a daycare centre, and that, in fact, that they don't have the capacity to respond on a regular basis if they see infractions. Mr. Speaker, those very same parents are taxpayers. They are not looking for an army of people to be out every day in child care centres. They are working closely with the department in areas where they believe it is important to report such infractions.
To Edmonton Goldbar.
Mr. Speaker, the license on the wall indicates certain things or certain perceptions that the public has as a result of that. Will the minister now inform the public that licensing and monitoring in no way, in daycares, in no way relates to training or qualification of the staff, that they're on their own in this regard.
Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member is saying that parents should be alert to the fact that it is very important for them to meet with the individual caregiver to see who it is that is interfacing and working with their children on a regular basis, then yes, I would say that's very important.
Main question.
Speaker, I would like to designate my main question to the member for Calgary-Buffalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a question to the Minister of Education. Earlier this session, our caucus attempted to point out to the government that cutbacks in education would be felt most by those requiring special education, and this is what is happening in both Calgary and Edmonton. In Calgary, special classes for high school students will have 16 in a class next year, which is a bad joke. To the Minister, in light of the recent debate between Edmonton Public and Edmonton separate school boards, which demonstrate how special needs students are taking a beating as a result of provincial cuts, is the Minister satisfied with the solution that Edmonton Public has been forced to find, namely to charge Catholic handicapped students a fee?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would preface my remarks by saying that despite attempts by the member for Calgary-Buffalo, there has not been a reduction in special education support this year, despite a difficult fiscal situation. In fact, there has been a 1.7% increase, as noted in the estimates which were tabled on March the 20th. With respect to the specific issue involving the Edmonton Public and Separate School Boards, there was an administrative difficulty between the two boards in terms of determining how many students each board was accommodating from another. The solution which has been arrived at is appropriate for both boards, and I am comforted by the fact that the only way that a parent would be required to pay an extra fee for his disabled child would be if that parent has removed his child voluntarily from the school board which he supports.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The problem is that the funding is both inadequate and unfair. Will the Minister quickly address, in her School Act, if it's ever coming or otherwise, the funding discrepancies which leave school boards handling high numbers of special needs students with an unfair burden, as is the case in Edmonton Public?
Mr. Speaker, the funding system is neither inadequate nor unfair, as I pointed out in my first answer. With respect for the manner in which some boards will attract more students who have special needs than other boards, and it's referred to as the magnet effect amongst school boards, we have provided for that in the maintaining the special education funding at the same level over last year. In fact, we have provided for what is a unique situation in Edmonton and other other municipalities who have, because of the number of kids coming into their system, built very special programs that attracts more students into it, and that is recognized by the change in funding which has been implemented for this year.
The funding remains exactly the same as it was, and that issue has not been addressed. And in the meantime, we find services to learning disabled children being eroded. Why doesn't the government do something to provide a financial incentive to hard-pressed school boards to maintain their programs to special education students by tying grants from lottery funds to the maintenance of quality?
Mr. Speaker, if education were underfunded in this province, the honourable member for Calgary-Buffalo would have a legitimate question, but it isn't, and he doesn't. With respect to the funding of services within our school systems, I am very pleased at the change to block funding which was implemented in 1984 with respect to the Department of Education on the needs of special education. The reason I'm pleased is that because now, instead of as is in the case in the past, every student, whether special need or not, has a home within this province. It is not possible for a school board to relinquish its responsibility for providing that student with an education. As well, we've seen a development of programs across this province which no longer requires a student with special needs to be removed from his home community. School boards across this province have responded in a very, very positive way. As a result, the program has vastly improved over where it was 3 years ago.
Well, it's supplementary to the Deputy Premier, and we don't need to read the newspapers to know that this is not an isolated problem and that handicapped students need all the representation they can get. And I'm wondering whether the Deputy Premier can advise the student on the progress being made in establishing the long ago announced Premier's Council for the Disabled, and when we might see that council actually in action.
Very shortly, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary, Edmonton Avonmore.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Education, what aid does she propose for parents and school boards where average children of parents attend one school system and the special needs children of those same parents have to attend another school system because services are not available in their first school system?
Mr. Speaker, if a program does not exist within the home school board of which the parent is a supporter, then that board is responsible for providing for the cost of funding a program in another board.
Banff Cochrane.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Education. The pupil-teacher ratio is a measurement of education favored by some individuals. What other methods are used by the Minister to assess the quality of education and the standards of education provided by school boards throughout this province? Be re-elected.
Mr. Speaker, that's a very important question, and I guess all of us could make our own assumptions as to what we deem to be the most important qualities or most important factors within quality. Certainly the size of a class and the pupil-teacher ratio is one indicator. It is not the only one. I would have to say that the achievement of students has to be a major indicator. I have to assume that how students do on exams, how the school system is providing programs such as special education programs is another. The whole monitoring of what is built into our system, particularly during a time when we have been forced to reduce that support as of September 1st, is part of what I will be following up on as school boards implement their reduction plans.
Clover Bar, followed by Edmonton Avonmore.
Mr. Speaker, my question is the Honourable Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs, and this has to do with regulations of banks and stock exchanges. And recently the federal government has signed an agreement with Ontario as to some new regulations, but they do not have just exclusive jurisdiction in that area. Can the Minister indicate what consultation took place between the federal government and the provinces before this unilateral decision was made with Ontario?
Mr. Speaker, on the 23rd of March this year, there was an interprovincial and federal meeting in Ottawa discussing the subject of the regulation of securities across Canada. That was a full day's meeting, and some matters were resolved in principle at that meeting. Subsequently, it was most of the province's understanding that there would be a follow-up meeting of ministers after the officials had had some opportunity to work out the details to the principles as I understood them having been agreed to at the meeting. There was then an agreement, an accord as they called it, struck between Ontario and Ottawa, which was signed on the 27th of April. That accord was arrived at between those two governments without consultation with any of the other provinces. I found out about that via telephone call some 2 hours before that accord was made public. I'm told that the other 8 provincial governments were made aware of it in the same fashion.
Mr. Speaker, is the Minister just going to stand idly by and allow this to happen, or is the Minister going to take her responsibilities and see what can be done to make sure that provincial jurisdiction is not invaded?
Mr. Speaker, there have been
great many consultations following on that bilateral move by Ottawa and Ontario. After some considerable amount of correspondence, I called for a meeting in Calgary on the 19th of May, which was held and attended by the provincial ministers. The federal minister finding his schedule to be so important that he was unable to attend and discuss the matter with the provinces. I might add that Ontario did attend that meeting on the 19th of May in Calgary. At that meeting, the provinces agreed that, the 9 provinces agreed that the accord, the bilateral accord, was not agreeable. And I can say and continue to say that it is not agreeable to the province of Alberta. Since then, we have been consistently calling upon the federal minister to meet with the provinces and to have further discussions on the subject. So far, he has been avoiding, or at least giving no particular cooperation in our efforts to have a multilateral discussion with him.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, is the Minister trying to communicate with other provinces to see if something can be done, or is the Minister just going to let the case rest?
I'm almost in daily contact with the other provinces in Canada and have been for all of the month of May and a considerable part of the month of April. This being the 2nd of June, I can say that I have been for all of this month as well to date. The position that the 9 provinces are taking is twofold. Number one, this accord that Ontario signed with Ottawa is very much, in our view, an incursion into a provincial responsibility, that is to say, securities regulation. And secondly, on areas that impinge or impact on provincial responsibility that have international consequence, there has been a protocol or a convention established that the provinces have full participation in negotiations leading to international agreements. And as an example, I would mention the General Agreement on Tariff and Trades, the multilateral trade negotiations, which are taking place in that manner.
Edmonton Meadowlark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister, I think, is correct in worrying about the incursion of the federal government into this area of provincial jurisdiction. However, if the Minister will not accept the Ontario model, what steps is the Minister taking to keep our securities industry competitive with Ontario, which is moving and being creative and creating a kind of securities industry with which we may not be able to compete?
Well, the honourable member for Edmonton Meadowlark has once again typically taken the Liberal view, but it is the Liberals in Ontario who are indeed moving to regulate a securities industry in Ontario in a manner that we in Alberta and other provinces across Canada think is unnecessary and would in fact put a further burden on the securities industry. There has been for years, for 30 years, what is called an exempt market in which sophisticated buyers and sellers operate without the intervention of governments or their bureaucrats. That is one of the parts that we are fighting to preserve here in Alberta, so that financial institutions and securities firms can continue to operate in the capital markets in a way that is appropriate to the burgeoning businesses here in Alberta.
Edmonton Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister, since trust companies are starting to act like banks, and banks are buying brokerage firms, and international companies are taking over trust companies, why didn't the Minister have her committee look into all this area instead of just narrowly focusing on the failures of the Alberta Stock Exchange in last summer's fiasco?
Mr. Speaker, I fail to understand the honourable member's question. I have not had a committee focusing on the failure of the stock exchange. I have had a ministerial advisory committee focusing on the structure of the Alberta Securities Commission, its roles and purposes, and that report, that discussion paper I filed in the Assembly last week. But to continue with what I think the honourable member wanted to ask and failed to ask, let me answer the question this way. We are in Alberta having ongoing discussions with other provinces, and we continue to work out our own policy positions, because we are very concerned and we intend to achieve a viable capital market in Alberta that achieves two things. One, it does not create artificial barriers to capital flows across Canada. And on the other hand, that it does not create artificial capital flows or capital activity for emerging businesses in Alberta.
Thank you. Member for Edmonton-Avonmore, followed by Edmonton-Goldbar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Hospitals and Medicare, yesterday the Minister, responding to questions regarding cutbacks to contraceptive services, stated that it was not his government's, and I quote, intent to try to seek out various groups that may represent some narrower point of view. End of quote. He makes this statement despite the fact that women represent 50% of the population and are traditionally held more responsible than men for contraception. My question to the Minister: does the Minister truly consider the very real concerns expressed by women regarding the elimination of certain contraceptive services to be those of some narrower point of view?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to acknowledge that indeed the cuts that were made or announced a week ago last Tuesday with respect to the medical care plan involving sterilization are ones that affect both men and women. The Assembly should also recognize that such things as contraceptive counseling are matters that are not female by themselves. Indeed, males and females ought to avail themselves of the opportunity for counseling in that area. Insofar as my remarks yesterday were concerned, what I meant to convey was that when I met with the Alberta Medical Association, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, the chiropractors, the podiatrists, the physiotherapists, and all of those groups, they were speaking, and I hope that I was discussing with them the effects of the health care insurance plan on everyone, just not males and just not females. It goes without saying that I have a very high regard for the views expressed by women in this province. If that were not the case, I would not have agreed so readily to meet and spend some considerable time with the Alberta Women's Council to seek their advice in this regard. So I make no apologies, Mr. Speaker, for having had that meeting and listened to the women of Alberta. I think that's an appropriate thing to do.
Mr. Speaker, podiatrists. Will the minister name those organizations which have specific concerns around contraceptive and reproductive counseling that have, in fact, the broad perspective that he values? Would he name the groups that he did, in fact, consult in regard to this matter?
Mr. Speaker, I've had regular communication with a number of groups that have interests in that area. Certainly, the whole question of abortion has been one that's been a subject of debate between various groups that provide contraceptive counseling and counseling involving people who have had abortions or who are seeking one. I haven't specifically sat down with any group and said this is what we're going to do in terms of the health care insurance plan. I have asked them for their opinions, just as I've asked members of the opposition for their views about what areas in the health care insurance plan can be reduced so that we can finance the plan within the budget that's been brought down. As I said yesterday, I'm still waiting to hear from the opposition in this regard.
Mr. Speaker, abortions are often a result of a lack of reproductive and contraceptive counseling and alternatives, and I offer no answer to this question. Will the minister advise what input he solicited from women's and women's groups prior to this announcement of contraceptive service cutbacks?
If the honourable member had been listening yesterday, she would have learned that a report which was the subject of some considerable discussion last week called In Trouble, A Way Out, which was commissioned by the directors of the Alberta Community Health System, which involves women in a very major way, did consult with a wide variety of groups and came to the conclusion that the present method of providing counselling in this province with regard to birth control and pregnancies is entirely inadequate. The report suggests that very few teenagers avail themselves of the opportunity to go to family physicians for contraceptive counselling. It goes on to suggest that the responsible way to provide additional counselling in this area is through community-based programs carried out by health units or family and community support services programs and in the schools. Now, Mr. Speaker, the report speaks for itself and, in my view, supports very strongly the direction that the Minister of Community Occupational Health and myself are heading, and it may be that the Minister responsible for Community Occupational Health would like to respond further to the question. It's a very serious problem, one that demands the attention of all of us. Again, Mr. Speaker, until this report was tabled, I heard nothing on this subject from any member of the opposition. I'm hoping now they'll have the opportunity to read the report and get some feeling for what the real problems are.
Mr. Speaker, women bear children from the age of 20 to 50 long after they're teenagers, and teenage pregnancy is only one part of the problem. And education and counseling is one part of the problem. Prescriptions and monitoring are also. What evidence can the minister offer to the women of Alberta that would cause them to reevaluate what must now be a reasonably held opinion that their views do not matter to this government?
Again, the honourable member does not recall that on May 26th I tabled in this legislature a letter to Dr. Richard Kennedy, President of the Alberta Medical Association, where I said in part that contraceptive counselling can and should be provided during the course of an office visit for a general annual checkup or for other regular office visits. I also indicated that if an individual is returning for a follow-up visit after receiving a prescription for birth control pills, that could be accommodated and billed under what's called an A4 or an H604. In other words, Mr. Speaker, in short, there are ample and adequate opportunities for general practitioners to provide contraceptive counselling and follow-up control. The honourable member would do well to read that letter. I just conclude by saying again, in the 3 months that this legislature has sat, Mr. Speaker, I've asked numerous times for the opposition's views on how we control health care costs. The only thing I've got so far is the proposal from the Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party and the Honourable Leader of the NDP Party that we close rural hospitals, and we simply can't agree to that.
Edmonton Goldbar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary to the Minister of Community and Occupational Health. Because of the acknowledgement from the Honourable Minister of Hospitals and Medical Care that community agencies can and should be providing family planning and contraceptive counselling services, will the Minister now finally consider taking these programs out of the competition of the Family and Community Support Services program and fund them directly?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I answered that question last week when I said that we were looking at the report prepared by the community health directors, and that we would hopefully have an announcement, have some action in place by the end of this month, early in the next. But, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member raises one very good question, and that is the responsibility of the communities. There are some 110 municipalities in this province that contract with the government to deliver family and community support services. 2 of 110 municipalities choose to do that. This is a problem And I would encourage those municipalities who enjoy funding this year 25% greater than they had 2 years ago to look at the problem, look at their priorities, relook at their priorities, and recognize this as a problem, an area that needs funding, and I'd encourage them to do that.
Is this a supplementary? Is this a supplementary, St. Albert, or just having a discussion? I see. All right. You can try. Edmonton Goldbar, followed by Edmonton Glengarry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Social Services. It appears that the Department of Social Services intends to establish an institutional facility for individuals with a mental handicap in the village of Youngstown. And this seems to be being done to alleviate overcrowding at the Michener Centre in Red Deer. To the Minister, the proposed facility is segregated from the village of Youngstown and is 43 kilometers from the nearest centre, that's Hannah. Will this allow residents and staff of the facility to participate in the mainstream of community life?
Mr. Speaker, a final decision on that the use of that particular facility has not yet been taken.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope that that's an indication. Does this then, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister indicate an admission that the Department is moving to or from the institutional approach to another approach which attempts to integrate mentally handicapped persons into communities?
Mr. Speaker, at all times, staff in the Department as well as Michener Centre are asked to put forward ideas that would alleviate or make better living conditions for the various people that have to be in our or take advantage of our services. I think the honourable member will know that there are two very distinct views in our society about the type of living that should be enjoyed by mentally handicapped people. We have the Association for Community Living, and we also have the Michener Parents Association, who have a very strong belief that the particular people in their lives should continue in institutional living. And Mr. Speaker, we are trying very hard to continue to make alternatives available to people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Michener Centre in the city of Red Deer, however, hardly can be compared to what's being contemplated here. Does the Minister believe that such facilities, institutions, if that is the route chosen, that they should have available to them recreational, religious centres, libraries, and be accessible to families and friends for visits?
Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member is saying should people have the enjoyment of rural living as well as urban living, I would say yes.
Mr. Speaker, this whole consideration is happening at a time when the government has turned down funding for the Boyle Street group home. Is this the government's policy to expand institutional approach and neglect the approach that establishes group homes integrated within the community?
Mr. Speaker, there are many, many group homes within the confines of the City of Edmonton as well as other municipalities. And if, for instance, we would choose to utilize the area of Youngstown for additional living facilities for mentally handicapped people, that would not be an expansion of the institutional system. Mr. Speaker, we would see that instead of the growth at Michener Centre, that we would see a downsizing of that centre.
Red Deer North, followed by Edmonton Highlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister, supplementary, can the Minister indicate to us if she has had communication with the parents of children at the Michener Centre indicating whether they would be consulted on a move from institutional living to community living?
Mr. Speaker, at all times, parents and guardians are consulted, and in no cases would there be a move without that consultation and concurrence.
Mr. Speaker, a few years ago, this government embarked upon a program that it euphemistically called deinstitutionalization of mental health patients, and it resulted in basically dumping them into the Boyle Street area. I wonder if the minister is now working with her counterpart, the minister responsible for housing, to follow up on the recommendations of the Committee on Homelessness from last week to ensure that those people have access to housing that is affordable and usable.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure there is a great concern and opportunity to discuss mental health patients, but Mr. Speaker, the people that are under discussion here are mentally handicapped.
Edmonton Glengarry.
Thank you,
Mr. by Graville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the Minister of Forestry, Lands and Wildlife, when the Minister announced the Kananaskis grizzly hunt for this spring, he started a continent-wide uproar which has created a coast-to-coast impression that Albertans have no respect for preservation of wildlife. I've received what I'd call an avalanche of mail on the issue, including one letter which said, knowledge of it will certainly discourage those who value wilderness unspoiled from spending their vacation, time and money in Alberta. Is the Minister not concerned that his ill-considered decision has given our nature-based tourism a black eye and another hunt next year will compound the damage?
Mr. Speaker, in reviewing the activity that took place since the hunt last year, one bear in Kananaskis was taken, and the regulations this year for that area, no permits will be issued in the Kananaskis area. The same hunting season will take place as previous in the year of 1986 and in other areas throughout the province.
I wish the Minister would repeat that. Did the Minister say there would be no grizzly hunt in Kananaskis next year?
The answer is yes.
Vegreville, followed by Calgary Mountain View, followed by Edmonton Meadowlark, if there's time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Honourable Minister of the Environment. The people in the village of Riley have been working for some months on an ambitious plan to develop an organic waste composting and recycling project in their community, and I'm wondering if the Minister could outline to what degree his department's been involved in this project.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm just delighted to inform the member from Vegreville that tonight I will be inaugurating in the village of Riley Alberta's first composting project with the symbol Captain Compost is now here.
Well, to Captain Compost across the way there. And I might remind the Minister there's many types of organic waste that can be composted. If this project, important project, proves successful, what plans does the Minister have to use the Riley project as a model for other community-based recycling programs?
Mr. Speaker, Riley will become the model in Alberta. It was less than a year ago that the individuals from the village of Riley came to me with their thoughts and their matter with respect to a recycling project. And over the last year that we've had an opportunity now to meet with the citizens of the village of Riley on several occasions, and through it all have now determined that very shortly this project will get underway. We'll inaugurate it tonight. It's my understanding that virtually every property owner, homeowner in the village of Riley will be participating. We've arranged that declare a new symbol for it, in addition to the watchdog, Captain Compost. We will have highway signs erected in directions leading from Riley, outlining that Riley is the composting leader in the province of Alberta. While it's an experiment and a pilot project at this point in time, I really believe that there's some exciting potential with respect to this matter in the use of compost for soil extenders, land reclamation projects, and on a commercial basis as well.
Could the Minister advise if this is an expensive undertaking for communities to get involved in? Or?
Mr. Speaker, as I've indicated on numerous occasions in the House, that the government is wide open for ideas and innovative ideas with respect to recycling and anything that could work and assist us in enhancing and improving the quality of the environment in this province. In this case, the composting project in the village of Riley is very small in terms of dollars. The amount of dollars that has been requested of us and the amount of dollars that we've agreed to allocate will be $12,000 in total. The village of Riley has also discussed and worked with other groups, private entrepreneurs in the province of Alberta, and will be receiving some additional benefit as well.
That blissful time, the end of the question period, has occurred, but might we have unanimous consent to complete this series of questions? Opposed? Additional supplementaries on this pungent issue? No. Orders of the day, might we revert briefly